Good morning everyone. This video is different because I want to talk about something that we've never talked about on my channel before, namely World of Warcraft. This is mainly a Tekken channel, and don't worry, I'm making more Tekken stuff right now. But I wanted to talk a bit about specifically the new cinematic intro that was shown for the newly announced expansion, Battle for Azeroth. I thought the cinematic was great, and it kind of took me by surprise because it's not typically the kind of thing I respond to as a video game player, but I thought this intro was really great, and so I watched it once and then I watched it again the next day and I liked it even more. And so today I was thinking a little bit about that, and I thought instead of just sitting around and thinking about it, maybe I'll make a video just discussing a little bit about why I thought it was really cool from a storytelling standpoint, because I think that's really the strength of it. So that's what the video is going to be. There's not going to be like a dramatic trailer reaction or anything from me. I think that would be very redundant. This video is probably redundant anyway, but I'm just going to make it for fun. So maybe somebody gets some enjoyment out of it. But yeah, I should just mention quickly that yes, I used to be a World of Warcraft player. I played it first when I was very young, maybe 13 or 14 when the game was new, and then I've played it on and off basically throughout my whole life. And at this point, I'm not that serious or hardcore anymore like I used to be. I usually drop in every new expansion and check out the new features and enjoy the game, and then gradually lose interest over a couple of months, because then you really need to start organizing yourself socially to play the game at a high level with rates and stuff, and that's not something that I'm super good at these days, especially not now where I live. You know, I play on European servers, but I live in Japan, so my time zones are completely off, and it becomes very hard to consistently have, you know, raid schedules and stuff. So but yeah, I wanted to talk about why I think this intro was really good. I don't know if like people generally have talked about this intro as being good, or people being excited about the expansion in general. I can only imagine that the response has been good so far. I just haven't looked it up, but it got me excited. And so thinking about why, the first thing that came to mind is I think World of Warcraft has become over the years a game that is really sort of narratively trying to chase its own tail, and I think that's because the narrative, if you listen to people who play World of Warcraft, is always that World of Warcraft used to be very good and used to be very important and a really big deal, and it's not that good anymore, or it's not as good as it used to be, and it's a lot worse, but it was amazing during, you know, Vanilla WoW or Burning Crusade and so on. That's not how I feel. I'm kind of distrustful about the concept of nostalgia. I think there's a lot of bias baked into nostalgia. You know, when you experience something for the first time, it's much more impactful just on your neurology, and especially when you're a lot younger. And so it probably just creates bigger impressions that might not have to do with like the objective quality of the game, but I don't know. But I feel like that's part of it, and then another part of it is elitism on the part of the gaming community, which is very typical for like an online MMO community like this. You know, if you can tell somebody that I played the game, you know, when it was new and you didn't, I played it years before you, and that's something that you can never go back to and experience, and so that gives me like this, you know, kind of like position above you in some sort of dominance hierarchy. It makes me one step above you, and so it's a kind of like rhetoric elitism that you see a lot in World of Warcraft. But I feel like even the developers constantly try and like sort of get back and recreate the magic of World of Warcraft when it was younger, and I think Legion did that in the sense that it wanted to reestablish class identity. I think that was like the main theme of the Legion expansion. The classes felt really watered down and, you know, not very distinct. And so now every single spec of every single class should feel very distinct. So, you know, they have different hubs, they have different aesthetics, they have these, you know, specific weapons. And so I think they really succeeded in reestablishing class identity in Legion. And what I feel like, just based on this cinematic intro, that they want to try and do in the next expansion is they want to reestablish faction identity. Horde and Alliance used to be a really big deal when I was young, and I was probably the first of my friends, because we all started playing Horde, and then just like a couple of months in, I switched to Alliance, and I was basically the only one who did, and that it wasn't a big deal, but it actually created some like social rifts and people really cared about this, and it was a fun thing to talk about. And so I think this is the main thing that they are trying to like reestablish with the next expansion. So why is this cinematic intro good pertaining to that? Well, I think that if you want to reestablish faction identity and make Alliance and Horde feel distinct, and the choice between them to feel like it really matters, I think reestablishing, you know, strong leaders and leadership figures and a strong like narrative behind the faction and the faction leaders becomes super important. I think from a storytelling perspective, this cinematic does that really well, and I think that's why I responded to it really in like a subconscious way. So I want to talk a little bit about the main characters in the intro. This is kind of like a deep analysis for something that is really short. So I mean, I'm clearly overthinking it, but I think it's fun to talk about anyway, so I'm just going to do it. So if we start with Sylvanas, who's like probably sort of the main centerpiece character of the intro, and why she may not have been like a very good leader for, like, from a narrative perspective for the Horde up until this point. I think, well, first of all, when the Horde when the game first came out, the Forsaken, which is her faction of the Horde, they were, you know, it was written all over the place that they were just really kind of allied with the Horde out of necessity, because if they didn't, then they were going to be destroyed, because they had their own city on the same continent as the main Alliance factions, and they were too weak on their own. And so while they may not actually be very interested in being part of the Horde, they sort of had to find geopolitical allies, and so that's why they became Horde. And now Sylvanas, who's the leader of the Forsaken, is the war chief of the entire Horde and the leader of the entire Horde, and that doesn't really jam really well. And she's also consistently been a selfish character and a mopey character and a whiny character. You know, she's been very emo in the sense that she's very pissed that she died and that she was brought back as an undead, and then it's been mainly her own goals, or mainly the goals of her own specific faction, the Forsaken, throughout her history. And that, like I said, it doesn't really jam well with the concept of her being not only war chief of the entire Horde, but war chief of a Horde which is, you know, this very honor-bound, traditional, noble, savage culture. And she's not really like an honor-bound type of character. She's more like a cunning character who's like, you know, she's got plans, and she's deceitful and stuff like that. She's also like a female elf and an undead, so there's a lot of like thematic differences between her and the Horde as a whole. And so if we look at what Sylvanas does in this intro, and why I thought it was really cool, is first of all, you know, she's standing behind her troops, behind the front line, shooting, looking pissed, and her soldiers are dying. And then we have this moment when they zoom in on her face. One thing that I thought was cool is she doesn't look pretty at all. Her lips are like chapped, her face is like really crumpled up, and she doesn't look pretty whatsoever. She just looks kind of angry. And then you can tell from, like, the animation is absolutely brilliant. She makes like some sort of like moral choice, and then she jumps in front of her own front line, destroys an entire Alliance siege engine by herself, and then she turns into her Banshee form, right? She kills some more soldiers, and then and I thought it was so cool because Banshees, you know, in World of Warcraft, but in like any mythology, are known for having these like powerful screams and voices. And so what is a way that Sylvanas can use her, you know, her being a Banshee, to really sort of rally the Horde? Well, she could give this really powerful war cry, and so she screams for the Horde. And the sort of magical moment that made that part of the trailer work for me is that you have this old orc, Sorfang, who's he's wounded, and he hears that, and he like immediately goes almost berserk, and he just runs into the fray, and then the rest of the soldiers follow him, and that was really cool. So I think that works because the Horde is a faction where, if you want to be an inspiring leader, I think first of all they respond to strength and battle prowess, and that's something that she demonstrates. You know, she goes alone heroically in front of her own front line instead of standing behind it just shooting at enemies. You know, she does a huge display of power, and then she gives this powerful war cry, and so that is something that I wouldn't have called like typical for the character up until this point, but it's something that is really sort of appropriate for a horde leader. And it's really cool that it's specifically Sorfang that they show, because Sorfang, for me, in this context, he sort of exemplifies the old horde. I mean, he's a really old orc. He's been like in the story of World of Warcraft, he's been part of like the horde from the get-go, and they've gone through so many like painful transformations where they've been disgraced over and over, and they've had so many civil wars. They've been corrupted by demons, and then there was the Wrathgate, and then there was, you know, Garrosh and that whole thing where the horde splintered again. So, and he's lost his son during Wrath of the Lich King. So this is like an old, battered, very tired orc. He represents this old, like, honor-bound version of the horde to me. And he sees Sylvanas do this, and he like responds immediately and very emotionally to her war cry. And so that's, I think, like just exemplifies the fact that she's now going to let go of her sort of mopey teenage personality and sort of rise to become something a little bit more like a real inspiring leader for her people. And the fact that she's able to like do this display of power and this powerful war cry then revivifies the horde. So it's like her, this new sort of visionary, new leader, new type of leader for the horde, breathing life into the old honor-bound typical horde. And that's what I thought, like, when they hear her war cry and they really sort of rise up. That's what it represented to me, and I thought it was really powerful and cool from like from a narrative storytelling perspective. I mean, I used to be an amateur writer. I've tried to write several novels myself. I'm probably not talented enough that that's ever going to go anywhere, but I'm very interested in storytelling, and I think that's an interesting direction to take her character that I think is going to work. And I think people who like the horde for specific like emotional reasons are going to be able to respond to her as a leader, and they're going to feel like it's going to feel like cool and nice to be horde again and have her lead you. That's going to be something that works. And so what I think they need to do with Sylvanas, like from a storytelling perspective, during the course of this expansion, is I want to see her sort of graduate from being mopey and vindictive. She's very vindictive, you know, she's pissed and she's cunning and she wants to trick people and she wants revenge, and then she wants to like live forever and bolster her ranks and stuff like that. All very sort of non-spiritual, selfish goals. And I want her to go back to, because Sylvanas used to be a Ranger General, right, when she was a high elf, and she died a hero's death, and she had her martyrdom basically, and then she was resurrected as an undead, and that's where all of her sort of troubles began. And so for me, I think what I would like to see happen is her rediscovering the Ranger General, you know, when she was an honor-bound, strong leader of her people, and she actually cared about stuff like kinship. She actually cared about stuff like sacrifice and responsibility, and sort of cast off this sort of like whiny, mopey, nihilist personality that she's had, and become more of like a true leader again. I want her to be a Ranger General once more. And that's only going to make even more sense now that the Blood Elves, which are basically, you know, what the High Elves became, are part of her faction. So she's going to have to rally these old, like, savage members of the Horde, like the Trolls and the Tauren and the Orcs, to her. The Forsaken have always been her core faction, and then if she can become more of like a High Elven Ranger General in the way she functions as a leader again, then obviously the Blood Elves, who used to be her subordinates during that age, will respond to that as well. And so I think there's a way for her to actually become a pretty cool sort of unifying leader for the entire Horde. And it sort of represents for me narratively this transition from nihilistic teenager to responsible adult. You know, you're a child and you think the world is an amazingly big and wonderful place. Then you're a teenager, you realize that it's a lot harder than you think. You're not going to get anything for free. It's very unfair, and so you become mopey, you become nihilistic, and then hopefully you're able to make this transition where you discover that if you can live responsibly, if you can live for the sake of spending time and sharing with other people, then you can sort of become happy as an adult. And then maybe becoming even older is about rediscovering the child again. It's sort of like cyclical in that way, but that's an entire tangent. But yeah, so the Horde for me, like the thematics of the Horde, it's honor, it's strength, and it's valor in death, and that really works with Sylvanas because she's actually undead. You know, she's really actually dead. So I think they can make that work, and I thought it was really cool. And then if we move on to the other side of the cinematic, which is, and the other main character of the cinematic, which is Anduin, a character that I have really disliked up until this point, just because, you know, he's been a kid and I don't like children. Most people don't like children, I think. I know that's obviously not true, but I think most people who watch movies or play games don't like child characters, I should say. He had a little bit of like the Anakin Skywalker problem for me, where he was like, oh, why is there a kid here all of a sudden? And he's like idealistic and saying big words, and it was just annoying. And Anduin super works in this cinematic. He works really, really well for me, and I'm going to talk about why. So if we talked about how Sylvanas was like a problematic leader before, let's talk a little bit about why Anduin has been like a bit of a problematic person as a leader for the Alliance up until this point. Well, first of all, he's been very, very young. And I think this is the first time we've seen him where he's at an age where he might actually be able to step into the role as king of the entire Alliance. So that was cool. Another thing is that he's just a priest. There's kind of like a thing where a lot of these, most of these sort of main leaders we see for the factions, not all of them, are really, really powerful fighters, and Anduin has been more of like a pacifist and a priest, and he's all about the holy light, and he's very meek, and that's cool that he's a bit of an idealist, but there's a great, it's very naive to live like that. I think that's another thing about like becoming adult, is like you can, I don't know anything about psychology, so I mean, if you do, please like enlighten me, but I think like in Jungian psychology, there's this thing called a persona, right, which is basically you have this image of yourself that you project out to the world, like, oh, I'm just a good person and I care about other people, and I'm a pacifist, I don't like war, and so on. But then every single human being, every single one has a lot of darkness, potential for darkness and violence inside them, and so being an actual good person, being an actual moral human being, or even a leader, is not about like, you know, embodying that persona. It's about like really delving into your own darkness, becoming acquainted with it, and then rejecting the really violent and immoral parts of it, but letting those other like parts of your own dark self empower you. And that's what I think should happen with Anduin's character. I think he needs to realize that if you are going to be High King of like a collection of states that are more or less constantly at war, you can't be a naive pacifist, because it's not going to lead to peace for all people. It's just going to make a lot of people die, and it's going to cost you your kingdom. So that's what that made me think of. Another thing I thought was really cool about Anduin is that he's definitely lived in the shadow of greater leaders up until this point. His father is basically the second greatest human warrior like ever in the history of World of Warcraft, you know, Varian Wrynn. And he's then named after probably the greatest human warrior ever in the history of World of Warcraft, Anduin Lothar. That's where he gets the name Anduin. Anduin Lothar, known as the Lion of Azeroth, was like this, like the greatest human knight of all time. And so that's Anduin's namesake, and I thought it was really interesting that he actually wears a lion mask into battle in this cinematic, because it's like he lives in the shadow of greater men, his father, and in the shadow of Lothar. And then a really cool thing that happens, and was like the defining moment for the character for me, is it's only... Okay, so first he gets attacked by a troll, and he's wailing on this troll with a sword, and he wins, but you can sort of see he's kind of like pathetically sort of wailing and whining, and he's kind of scared and desperate when he does that. But it's only when he's gotten this this lion mask, this sort of intimidation tool that is supposed to, like, you know, signify Lothar, gets knocked off his head, and he puts down his father's sword, that he's able to actually do you know, play his role. And it's his defining moment as a leader of his people, because he does something specific to him. You know, he's a priest and he uses the holy light. So he uses this divine power to sort of revivify and soothe his troops, and they rise up and they follow him. And so yeah, that's something that is really, really cool, and it's a theme you see a lot in all kinds of good storytelling and a lot of mythology going back. Is this idea of like the young, inspired, visionary leader who then needs to sort of cast off his naivete and get over the fact that he lives in the shadow of his own father, and it's only then that he can use his sort of visionary ability to become a true leader. And it sort of becomes that point where you have like vision for the future, coupled with, you know, an understanding of where you came from, like your father, your tradition, and your culture, that you get like great leaders in history and mythology and stuff like that. So I thought that was really, really cool. And then the other important character, like in the cinematic, is the last one is Greymane. And Greymane is just a complete mirror of what Sorfang was for the Horde side. It's the personification of the old alliance, in the same way Sorfang is the personification of the old Horde. Again, Greymane in the story, I'm not super like knowledgeable about Warcraft lore, but I know he was a part of like the original alliance of Lordran, so he's been part of the alliance since its inception. And then he sort of left and did his own thing for a while, but he seems to be very gung-ho about the Alliance lately. And he's the old wolf, and he defers to this young, more visionary leader, calls him, you know, my king. And then Anduin uses his power to breathe life into, you know, the old Alliance. So it's this visionary new leader breathing life into this old tradition and culture in the old Alliance, and they rise up. And then Greymane for that is a personification of that, and I think they're even trying to push it even more, because you see these troops on both sides wearing sort of traditional old Horde armor and Alliance armor, and it has a lot of imagery from the earlier games and stuff. So it's this thing of you know, World of Warcraft narratively chasing its own tail and trying to be what it used to be a lot of the time. So yeah, if the Horde is like strength, martyrdom, valor and death, Alliance for me has always been more about thematically purpose, like divine purpose, a sense of that their culture is something greater than the sum of its parts, and it has this sort of like, you know, very actually like religiously thematic thing going on all about it, where yeah, they are sort of like the chosen people, and I felt that really resonated with how he uses this like holy light to heal his troops and everything. So I thought that was really cool as well. So now that I've talked about that, that's probably like, it's obviously really overthinking it, but I think that's what really made me respond to the cinematic from a narrative perspective. And now I want to talk a little bit about, because I am, at least in Partisan, how I think they're going to probably fuck it up during the expansion. That's a cynical thing to say, but this is what I hope does not happen narratively with World of Warcraft going forward, because this is the first time, I should say, in a very long time that I'm actually very interested in what's going to happen with specifically the story of World of Warcraft, because it's not villain of the week anymore. It's like not an even bigger threat has come up, and now we need to, you know, rise to the challenge and go fight this bigger threat, and it's kind of a repetitive thing that's been going on for a long time. The first thing, if we talk about these two characters, Sylvanas and Anduin, is I do not want Sylvanas to die or stop being the War Chief of the Horde. I want to see her gradually become a more and more adequate and strong leader for the Horde. I don't want her to be mopey, I don't want her to be vindictive, and I don't want to see her do selfish things that are her own, you know, her own selfish agenda or the agenda of the Forsaken. She has to now be about the Horde as a whole. That's what I want to see for her. And the last thing, and the most important thing that they cannot do anymore, is they cannot have another like splintering of the Horde and another civil war, because they've had that like 4 or 5 times throughout their entire history. Part of the Horde goes bad, the Horde splinters, the good part of the Horde tries to convince the Alliance that they're the good part of the Horde and it's only bad apples, and then they fight this new like bad splinter faction of the Horde, and then they try and reinstate themselves, and that's such a tired cycle at this point. And it really waters down, and the identity of the Horde as a faction makes it less fun to play. So I don't think that should happen. I think the Horde should get all these new races come in, and it should be stronger and more unified than ever under her. I think that's the narrative direction to take her character. I also don't want her to die, but if she dies, I think she should die like and get her martyrdom that she should have had when she was Ranger General, and be remembered as a great leader. If there's enough time to build her up to that point during the expansion. But I would like to see her survive, and I would like to her to be the War Chief of the Horde going forward for a long time. And if we look at Anduin, I think I want him to not grow pacifistic. I want him to not, you know, constantly talk about how we need to stop all this fighting, because he lives in a world where he's constantly at war, ideological wars, and they are invaded by all these forces that are truly malevolent. You know, you can talk about peace with the Horde, but then there's like demons and there's like old gods and stuff, and if he's going to be a leader, he cannot be meek. He needs to actually be capable of violence, but he without stooping to being, you know, an evil character. I think that's very important, and I think they've already taken a step towards that, because if you look at the cinematic intro, he's laying siege on the Undercity, on Lordran, right? So he's actually the aggressor, the military aggressor in the story of the cinematic, and that's very interesting. It would have been much more like easy to just make this thing where the Horde are like attacking and trying to burn down Teldrassil, which apparently is going to happen in the story, and then have Anduin go, oh no, we have to defend the tree, and I'm so weak and stuff, and that would have been really boring. But now he's like wearing this badass armor and he's attacking something, and I think that was cool. And I don't... Oh, the other thing is I do not want Gen Greyming, because they've been flirting a little bit with Gen Greyming being very bitter about the Forsaken, and he's kind of vindictive, and he's kind of revenge-driven as well, and I don't want him to descend into that. I want him to be the Obi-Wan Kenobi to the Luke Skywalker of Anduin. I want him to be the old master who has been a king for a very long time. He's an old, tired king at this point, and he doesn't have like the vision to be the leader of the entire alliance, but he's a very, very good mentor, and so I want them to sort of be this cool dichotomy and lead the alliance together. And I want him to they put him at a perfect spot right now where he is, and he's a little bit angry and a little bit pissed and a little bit vindictive, and I don't want them to push him further, because we don't need any more major story characters, you know, be driven by revenge and go into darkness, because that's something that we've famously seen repeated in World of Warcraft so many times, you know, whether it's Arthas or Illidan or, you know, whoever else. And I want to just mention this really quickly. I personally think that revenge is really bad writing. If you want to write a plot or you want to have a story, writing a revenge story is almost like a cop-out. It's really, really poor writing. And if you look at some of the most hack movies ever made, like for example the Death Wish movies. If you're into B movies, you've probably seen at least some of the Death Wish films with Charles Bronson, and those are all about, okay, so you have this character, he doesn't have to have any depth, he doesn't have to have even any acting ability, he just needs to have like a little bit of a badass vibe, and you then rape and murder his family and everything he cares about. You try and have one emotional scene where you make the audience actually care about that, and then the rest of the movie is just going to be him. You know, it's just going to be gratification where he kills everybody and he just goes around being a badass. And that's one of the reasons that I actually didn't like Taken. I know Taken is a really popular film, and it was a fun watch, but it was so divisive how in the beginning they just want to make you identify with this main character. You know, he gets pushed down and he buys the karaoke machine for his daughter, but the karaoke machine isn't good enough, and we feel sorry for him and we identify with him. He's so everyday and he's so us, and when he's just completely the protagonist, we've identified with him, we feel sorry for him. He just turns a switch, he becomes this ultimate violent badass, and then the whole rest of the movie is just him killing a bunch of people and not even getting like hurt once. And it's sort of watching that and going, yeah, it's so cool. It sort of just felt like masturbation to me. I don't like revenge plots. I think characters should be a little bit more three-dimensional than that, and I hope that there are no more like divisive cop-out revenge plots for the characters in this expansion or for World of Warcraft going forward, because I think one of the reasons I think this is interesting, this intro and the direction of the narrative, is that it's focusing on characters and it's not focusing on the world or the next threat or the next villain and what's happening with the world. It's actually characters, and it's very it's kind of like a novel concept in this point in World of Warcraft, I think. And another thing I just want to mention here is I do not want this story to get lost in trying to create more epicness. I think epicness is it's been taken way too far already, and it's only going to get worse if, like, first you're fighting like monsters, then you're fighting demons, then you're fighting gods, then you're flying around in space fighting, you know, the actual creators of the known universe, and like, where do you go from there? It just becomes this really pointless escalation of power and more epicness that doesn't really lead anywhere, and it doesn't have any destination, and it doesn't really tell a story along the way either. And that's like, you could call it the anime problem. If you ever watch anime, that's something that happens to a lot of these animes that are very long. They just push the envelope in terms of how powerful the characters are, and it becomes completely ridiculous. And that is, in my opinion, why the anime One Punch Man became so popular, because it's just totally a commentary on that concept. You have a character who's already on like the absolute pinnacle of power, and he can do all these things, but he still needs to worry about, you know, buying cheap groceries so that he can feed himself, and his life is kind of pointless. And it's I think people subconsciously respond a lot to that because they've seen this, whether it's Marvel Comics, whether it's World of Warcraft, whether it's, you know, your favorite anime or television drama. It just pushes the envelope in terms of like epicness and tries to get bigger and bigger and more all-encompassing in like its world building, but it fails to tell a story along the way, and so it becomes pointless. I should also mention that I don't think, and when we talked about revenge plots, I don't want to see Jaina go down like a dark path and become a revenge-driven character either. I mean, she's been pissed. A lot of like bad things have happened to her. She's got white hair now. She's angry. She's a little bit disillusioned. But I think, can she just be a little bit of a pissed, angry leader and powerful mage who's part of the Alliance without all of a sudden going, I'm just going to destroy everything and be a villain, and then I'm going to show up as some sort of like raid boss along the way? That would be very sad. I would actually much prefer to see Jaina reinstated as a more integral part of the Alliance, especially now that it seems that the new continent that the Alliance are going to explore is her original kingdom, her home country. So yeah, I think that's going to wrap up like my little discussion of the cinematic intro. It's way too long. It's many times longer than the intro itself. Like I said, I'm probably overthinking this, and it's probably a redundant video, but I thought it was a fun thing to think about because I like storytelling. And I do love the world of World of Warcraft. When you've been playing it for as long as I have, and as long as, you know, most people who play it have, it's part of us, it's part of our childhoods, and it's going back to World of Warcraft for a lot of us. It's like going home. And although a lot of people, there's a lot of elitism talk about how the game used to be good and how it's shit now and how Blizzard are, you know, hacks and whatever. I think, yeah, it is going home for many of us, and it's there is a lot of inherent quality to this game. And even though the storytelling of the game hasn't been top-notch over the last couple of years, this was an indication to me that it might actually be, because I think the reason we loved the story of Warcraft 3 is because it was character-driven. We cared about Arthas and Jaina and Thrall and all these characters, but we, you know, haven't gotten a lot of that character-based story narrative since the inception of World of Warcraft. We've seen much more focus on the actual world and the villains. So yeah, if anybody ends up watching this video and enjoying it to any extent, then I might make one more where I talk a little bit about like the new allied races and some other cool stuff that was unveiled about the expansion. And if the response to the video is not, you know, isn't there, then I might just, you know, leave it at this and focus on making stuff for Tekken going forward. But let me know what you think. Let me know, you know, you probably have a lot of opinions about the things that I've said, and I'm interested to hear them. So let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Oh, by the way, let me know, is there a release date for this expansion yet? Because I haven't looked that up. I would be interested to know when we get to play it. But yeah, thank you so much, and I'll see you guys very soon. Bye bye.